Supermarket in California by Ellen Ginsberg. What thoughts I have of you tonight, Walt Whitman, for I walk down the side streets under the trees with a headache, self-conscious, looking at the full moon. In my hungry fatigue and shopping for images, I went into the neon fruit supermarket, dreaming of your enumerations. What peaches and what penumbras, whole families shopping at night, aisles full of husbands, wives in the avocados, babies in the tomatoes, and you, Garcia Lorca, what were you doing down by the watermelons? I saw you, Walt Whitman, childless, lonely old grubber, poking among the meats in the refrigerator and eyeing the grocery boys. I heard you asking questions of each. Who killed the pork chops? What price bananas? Are you my angel? I wandered in and out of the brilliant stacks of cans following you, and followed in my imagination by the store detective. We strode down the open corridors together in our solitary fancy, tasting artichokes, possessing every frozen delicacy, and never passing the cashier. Where are we going, Walt Whitman? The doors close in an hour. Which way does your beard point tonight? I touch your book and dream of our odyssey in the supermarket, and feel absurd. Will we walk all night through solitary streets? The trees add shade to shade, lights out in the houses. We'll both be lonely. Will we stroll dreaming of the lost America of love, past blue automobiles and driveways, home to our silent cottage? Ah, dear father, graybeard, lonely old courage teacher, what America did you have when Sharon quit poling his ferry, and you got out on a smoking bank and stood watching the boat disappear on the black waters of Lethe? Good evening, BookTube. I've been kindly asked or invited to do the supermarket shopping book tag by Byways and Bookland, its creator. And so I am dressed in my shopping clothing that I have to wear now when I go to the supermarket. And so let's start the tag. So the first question Jason asks is about lists. Before going shopping, including virtually, do you have a list? Obviously for the supermarket it's a great idea to have a list. I try to do that. Usually I put the fruit and veg first, and then Jason made some really interesting comments about fruit and veg is the first thing you encounter in a supermarket, and he said there was some psychological reason for that. Yeah, I like to do that. I like to have a list that starts with the fruit and veg and then moves on through the other sections, but generally I don't really know what those sections are necessarily in order, but I know the milk is always down the back. I believe for the reason that people who are looking for that particular staple are then forced to walk past everything else in the shop. But when book shopping, I don't carry a physical list. Like most of the people who've responded to the tag, I have an ongoing mental dialogue with the world of books, and volumes recommend themselves to me according as I encounter them in the media, literary blogs, critical texts, through the canon, and even sometimes on BookTube. And that's all fermenting away nicely in the interior spaces of my head, so that when I'm in a bookshop, I will generally find something that I'm looking for. I've been very lucky. Usually where I generally have lived and worked is in pretty central locations, so I have access to a lot of bookshops, and plenty of time to go around and do the rounds of them. So hopefully actually one day I will be able to add Jason's bookshop to my rounds, because I think the place that he intends to locate it is somewhere that I often visit and will have plenty of recourse to. So the second question, fruit and veg. Good for the body and the mind. Recommend a book you felt improved your physical and mental health. So Jason was kind enough to talk about as I say, the psychology behind the location of the fruit and veg aisles in our supermarkets. Actually did once read a book about retail psychology, which actually was very, very interesting, believe it or not. So I am quite interested in that topic. But as for books which are good for the body and the mind, I don't buy a lot of self-help books, but I did once buy a book called Total Immersion Swimming, which I can highly recommend to anybody who is interested in improving their form as a swimmer in the water. It offers a huge amount of really interesting information about, how to swim as if you feel like you're swimming downhill, as if you have a keel. Lots of really good information. So that certainly improved my swimming technique. I'm still not a great swimmer because I'm a pretty lazy person, but that was a great book. I remember once reading a book called The Happiness Hypothesis by Jonathan Haidt. I think he's probably not a very popular figure at the moment, but anyway, it was a really interesting book about human psychology, the way in which the older parts of our brains, basically, which evolved millions of years ago, have a lot more power than we probably give them credit for. And why that's interesting is because, when we consume huge amounts of sugary food, that's our body basically trying to pack in these emergency calories in case there's going to be a harsh winter coming, which, of course, in our privileged Western society never comes. Although this winter I think might be a little bit harsh, and maybe harsher than people realise. So that was interesting. Tinned goods is the third question. Regardless of the label on the can, the contents are all too often bland. What is your tinned can genre? I don't know. I mean, I'd probably say fantasy about this because I think I've only ever read one good fantasy book, and that was The Lord of the Rings, predictably. There are a lot of poor imitations of The Lord of the Rings out there. I do like well-written science fiction. Not really a huge amount of it, but I have read, I think, like some of the classics of science fiction over time. But for me, fantasy just seems to encourage all this terrible world building with little maps at the front, and they often read like the first book of Genesis, and lo, Mortok begat Elendrinel and did fashion with magics and spear of great cunning, and it's just like a Dungeons and Dragons campaign or something. I even read the first book of the Game of Thrones series, and while of course the plotting is very good, and I can see how he's working with this very interesting historical material from the Wars of the Roses or the English history. Just the writing is just so indifferent, so inconsistent. The prose, it just reads like these are modern American people half the time, and it just doesn't work for me. And actually, I think the first season or two of the TV series were just far superior to the book. Now, of course, they went on to absolutely ruin that show, so there you go. But yeah, I often think TV and cinema can work much better with that kind of material. And again, I don't like prize type fiction, the kind of fiction that generally wins prizes in England every year. It's often books written by people who went to Oxbridge and have really nothing to say formally in literary terms or at all. So again, it's just not really for me, very bland. So, question 4. The meat and fish counter. Prepared by a skilled butcher fishmonger, just how you want it. Tell us about a book you felt was written just for you. I think actually I'm going to pick a book here which I have, which is At Swim Two Birds. It's a book I read when I was about 19 or 20 years old, and it was written by Flann O'Brien, I'm sure, as everyone knows. But when I opened that book and I read the first page, I immediately felt at home. This is the kind of thing that, this is what literature, can do and can be. I'm not saying it's the be all and end all of literature at all. I mean, every book is different. But I'm just going to read. I have actually very privileged to have a nice old hardback edition of this book, and I'm going to read the first opening page, or paragraphs.
There's a dedication in Greek there actually, which I have no idea what that means. Chapter 1. Having placed in my mouth sufficient bread for 3 minutes chewing, I withdrew my powers of sensual perception and retired into the privacy of my mind, my eyes and face assuming a vacant and preoccupied expression. I reflected on the subject of my spare time literary activities. One beginning and one ending for a book was a thing I did not agree with. A good book may have 3 openings entirely dissimilar and interrelated only in the prescience of the author, or for that matter, 100 times as many endings. Then it goes on to give examples of 3 separate openings. And the first opening is one that's concerned with old Irish folklore type figures. So again, it just seemed that everything I'd been thinking about and reading about up to that point was sort of culminating in that text, and it's very funny. I mean, the portentous register of the prose, the tedious sort of nature of putting the bread in the mouth, what the young student who's writing this is thinking, and the sort of, while it is formally engaged, it's also sort of a slight irony about that. So that was a book I really enjoyed, and I felt, that was just for me. So question 6, the chill section. Recommend a cool new author or book you recently discovered. So I'm going to say a book, I don't know if you can see that, but The Quarantine of St. Sebastian House. I'm going to leave a link in the description for this book, but it's a short novella, short plague novella, written very quickly over the first month or so of the coronavirus outbreak. The author is John Pistelli of the who has a website, who's an academic in America, but he also has a really great literary blog which I've been reading for many years. With, what he writes accords with the way I think about literature myself. Not always, I don't always agree with what he has to say. For example, he doesn't like Karl Ove Knausgaard, who I do really like. This novel he's written, it's a short novel of about 85 pages or thereabouts, and it takes place in a building with the protagonists living on all the different floors of the building. So you have this really interesting poetics of space, and it's a novel of ideas. It explores the kinds of ideas that John Pistelli often talks about on his blog, about aesthetics versus kind of didactic, pedagogical, ideologically driven forms of art making, especially within the realm of literature, and plumps, I think, for the former for an aesthetic, formal engagement. So it's quite funny. It's really interesting on ideas of what one can actually know about art, but also about the coronavirus, because there's just so much bloody information out there, and the more you look into it, the less you seem to know, and he shows that very, very well in his book. So I'm going to recommend The Quarantine of St. Sebastian House by John Pistelli. Question 7, the frozen section. Tell us about a book that gave you the shivers. So Jason was talking there recently about, when he talked about this, he talked about a book, James Herbert, a horror book called The Rats. And I've read a few horror type books. I read The Rats when I was a kid, but those books haven't really frightened me. But there was a book by Graham Swift called Waterland, which was made into a movie, actually, speaking of Game of Thrones, because the movie starred a very young Lena Headey. The actress was Lena Headey in that, who plays Cersei Lannister in the Game of Thrones TV show. But the book takes place, I think, around, or maybe just after the Second World War. But it harkens back to an earlier period in the life of a particular family, with a brewery, and there's a point in that novel where there's a great big fire, and a face appears at the window during the fire, and when that face appeared at that window, I was lying in bed. I had suffered an appalling sunburn. I was in bed for a week with that, and in Italy, and I couldn't sleep. The pain was just too great, and I was just reading for night after night. And at about 4 o'clock in the morning, that face appeared at the window as I was reading that novel, and it put the heebie-jeebies up me. Question 8. Beers, wines, spirits. Name one of the first books you read that made you feel like an adult. So when Jason was talking about this, he referred to The Rats by James Herbert, and he talked about, very interestingly, how the local librarians where he's from had allowed him to look at this adult material, which shocks me, basically, that these little old ladies in the local library with their cardigans and their glasses and their hair in a bun were allowing young children like Jason to run around Carrick and Shore reading quite shocking and horrifying literature. But I mean, when I was a kid, I enjoyed reading that kind of stuff as well. One of the interesting things about books, I think probably most readers have experienced this, is that while when you're a kid, there's all kinds of stuff you're not allowed to look at on TV, there's all kinds of movies you're not allowed to watch, nobody ever really takes any notice of what you're reading. So, you know, when I was a kid, I used to read all kinds of stuff that was not really appropriate for my age, or, well, it maybe might have been deemed to be that way. Often I'd read it standing in a bookshop, just on the shelf, just reading away. I've read many books in bookshops. It's actually a great place to read. But I don't know if I would say that any. I mean, I've read a lot of material that was adult, but I don't think reading adult material ever made me feel that I was an adult. For me, it's more like that I moved on from books that were for children, and I even though that kind of genre material or horror material or, you know, rude material, that was never adult material for me so much as was entertaining material. And I'm not sure I even still feel particularly adult. I drift and lost just like most people. And while literature, you know, serves a huge purpose in my life, or is a place of real meaning for me, it doesn't solve problems particularly, or, you know, create a kind of adult mentality where I'm equipped to deal with what the world has to throw at me. I think, you know, an adult is someone who has matured, and we can all have issues with our maturity. So I don't know if I can actually pick a book that made me feel like an adult. Question 5. Baked goods. Bread is a staple for many around the world. Who is an author you can easily digest any time of the day? So, like a lot of people who are getting a little bit older, I have issues with bread. I find that my weight doesn't, you know, appreciate the constant ingestion of breads as I like to do on a daily basis. I also read recently that bread is a enslaving device where you know, humanity, once we're growing wheat, and in order to be able to be taxed by our betters, we were actually much worse off. So bread is bad all around. Let's face it, even though it's bad for us, it's great stuff. So who is an author you can easily digest any time of the day? For me, again, I could nearly go back to Flann O'Brien here, and just in a different register. Flann O'Brien, while he wrote a number of novels, he also wrote a humorous column in the Irish Times for many, many, many years, and those columns have been collected into several volumes, and they're absolutely hilarious, very funny, very witty. You know, P.G. Wodehouse wouldn't be in it with the timing, the comic timing of the prose, the hilarious concepts. Like, I have literally been corpse reading this stuff, just laughing my head off with these unexpected turns in the prose. So that kind of material I can just turn to any time, and it's just wonderful. So question 9. Sweets, candy. What genre is your author or indulgence when you need a little treat read? I actually like comic books. I said earlier I didn't really like fantasy. But actually, that's really about prose. I can read that kind of genre material all day long in comic books. It doesn't work for me in prose, but in a comic book, for some reason, it does work, and maybe that's because it's a visual medium, and you often get these wonderful artists working on this material, and it just elevates the stuff and brings it to a different level. And because you have comics are so formal because of the way in which the storytelling happens from panel to panel, that it's not just the story that's being told that's a treat, it's the way in which the story is being told. So for me, comic books, I do read a lot of the kind of graphic novels that are, the more serious side of comic books, autobiographical comics, that sort of thing. But I read a lot of, Marvel superheroes and Image comics and Dark Horse comics and that kind of stuff. So for me, that's a real treat. Question 10, the magazine stand. If you read magazines, journals, regularly share some titles. So question 10, magazine stand. If you read magazines or journals regularly, share some titles with us. So I like magazines, I have to say. I like journals. It's a real treat to go to a newsstand and just pick up a bunch of really nice magazines. I really like architecture magazines for some reason. I like Dwell, Architecture Digest. There's the Royal Irish Architect Institute, or Institute of Architects, no, the RIAI or whatever it's called. It produces a magazine which is really great. I also read political magazines, so I like Private Eye. It's a small UK weekly which goes through political dirt and that kind of material. I really enjoy that. I read the Irish equivalent, which isn't as good but is still quite interesting. I often pick up maybe a copy of Foreign Policy or the Economist occasionally. I'll pick up an art magazine from time to time, the art newspaper, Art Forum. I've subscribed from time to time to the New York Review of Books, the London Review of Books, Book Forum, although I've left those subscriptions lapse, because in particular the New York Review of Books just comes in an absolute deluge all the time, and I never read the whole thing. But I did recently find that it seems to be a worldwide phenomenon, but there are a couple of apps like Press Reader and Orbi Digital app, which you can use through your library subscription or your local library service. You just pop in your library card number and you can read all these magazines for free online. So I've started reading the New York Review of Books again through that. I read these on my iPad. The iPad is a great magazine reader. The photographs look fantastic, so I've been reading the New Yorker on that, the New York Review of Books on that, Viz Comic on that, and the daily newspapers from UK, Ireland and the USA. So check out time to go home and unpack. Tag some shoppers on their way in. So I haven't been around here for long enough to be tagging people, but obviously anyone who enjoyed this is free to do it, and maybe drop me a comment and let me know that you've done it, because I'd love to see more of these videos. So thanks very much, and thanks Jason for tagging me.